I'm Jessi, this is Nick, and this is Karen, in case there was any confusion, but if there was, I worry more about you than us.
Let's.
And that was a great introduction, Evan. But it strikes me that Evan began this conversation by framing it in terms of what is fake and what is not. And I want to take a step back from that and begin by talking about what visual content is doing in our realm, which is really communication and news right now, and what we can do with it. And once we understand that a little bit, we can talk about some of the more nefarious ways that that is happening and what we can do about it. So with that, Nick, I'll start with you because you're at the New York Times. What role does visual communication play in news right now?
At the Times, the ability that we have to tell stories visually now, largely rooted in new technology, is really changing the way that we tell stories overall. And we have a very innovative graphics desk who have been on the forefront of experimenting with VR and AR and a lot of other techniques that don't get surfaced quite so obviously in the report. I spent some time preparing for this talk, talking to some of our people who do video investigations, for example, which often do take the form then of like reconstructions of scenes. We did a big piece around the Las Vegas shooting, for example, but that's a really powerful technique.
So just to stay on that a second, when you say video investigation, what do you mean by that?
It means looking at all of the available imagery around a particular like newsworthy incident as a means of reconstructing what actually happened. Mm-hmm. We'd done stories recently, on the Las Vegas shooting where we were actually ahead of police investigators in reconstructing the exact timeline of what happened. But also, we did a story recently on the chemical weapons attack in Syria where we were able to get, multiple photographs of the rubble and remnants of some of the delivery, like the bombs, and we're able to disprove claims made by the Syrian government based on reconstruction analysis of that rubble and basically running the movie backwards and seeing what actually happened.
So that is incredibly interesting, and it speaks specifically to 2018 and the set of tools that are available to us and our knowledge about how to use those tools in 2018. I want to take a step back and trace sort of how we got to this point. And so now I'll move to Karen. Karen, I started following your work probably when you were at Google. You were at Twitter. You are, in other words, a veteran of editorial strategy in Silicon Valley. I hope that's fair to say.
It's very kind of you to say.
And when you started your editorial career, I'm just going to take a bet that words were a more powerful tool for you usually than pictures. But maybe that's not true.
No, absolutely. Words were and still photos, right?
Right.
And the right one, and you didn't have as many to pick from as now, for sure.
So tell me a little bit about the evolution, how we got from a point where a news editor may have chosen a still photo to a point where I can use this new little app called Leo AR to put a dinosaur and a giraffe in the middle of my kids' nursery and make them dance around.
Yeah, well, I think we have to once again give credit to Steve Jobs and the iPhone, right? That seemed to be a turning point, at least for a lot of people with smartphones, to having the ubiquitous camera. And if you recall, I think maybe 2008 was an election where suddenly people had cameras, iPhones and smartphones at political rallies. And that began to uncover embarrassing gaffes in real time that nobody could erase or Photoshop or delete and be done with.
There's this one image that I remember, I wonder if you guys remember it, of people watching the Pope. And they were watching the Pope with their cameras above their heads, and all you could see was a sea of lenses. And that image is from, I think, 2009 or so, just a couple of years after the iPhone.
Yeah.
And it was telling for me because it was the moment where I realized that actually people weren't using words to tell stories as much as they were using pictures in new ways. And our industry, collectively, because I'm going to lump us all into the same industry, editorially, news, also has sort of tried to harness that. And with that come new challenges. So I want to sort of tease out those challenges a little bit. Karen, I'm going to step back to you a second. When did you first begin to notice that actually there were, I'm going to use the word, I don't want to use the word fake news. I want to instead back up and say that the problem of how to read this content was emerging?
Well, certainly before this election in 2016 in the U.S., so probably with a year or two before that, the rise of social media in particular, I would say Twitter and Facebook, meant a lot of things were circulated more in real time, more widely, no matter what they were, no matter what the origin was, right? So we're suddenly used to seeing a steady stream of all kinds of things. But I would say now we know more about the campaign for the 2016 election and how that led some new bad actors or bad actors doing new things into the scene.
And do you feel that? So you were in the Valley. Do you feel like tech companies saw that coming and understood that coming? Is it?
No. And by which I mean, I'm sure there were people inside companies thinking about what if scenarios of all types. But in general, I think people were caught a little flat-footed by specific bad actors doing specific bad acts,
Sure.
right? That was new. I think that people had not especially anticipated. I don't know, Nick, if you agree.
No, I definitely agree, and I think, and this is going to sound a little bit like an attack on the platforms, and I don't actually mean it this way, but I think there was a willful blindness that was rooted in the way that copyright law had developed since the beginning of the internet and the whole safe harbor concept, where the sort of default position for any platform had been to to claim that they had no knowledge of the content.
We're
and
not
their responsibility
publishers.
for it. Yeah. So there's interesting parallels to the sort of copyright battles, particularly around the music industry, that I think also do have some lessons for how we might think about dealing with some of these problems, and those stem from the same cause.
Yeah, I agree.
And Nick, to what degree do you feel news organizations understood early on the power of the visual image to tell stories, and how did that change in the advent of the iPhone?
I mean, I think news organizations have always, since the dawn of photography, have always understood the power of imagery. I think some, such as our organization, have always had ambivalence kind of about that power, and it wasn't until the 90s that we allowed color photography, as everybody, sort of somewhat famously, because I think part of the internal debate, and I certainly wasn't there at the time, was that it was too manipulative or too powerful, and it's like just the facts, like facts are black and white,
Right. Right.
So, but I think, that we've always respected the power, and I think, first we tend to look to the investigative possibilities, and then second we turn to the second order consequences of of imagery coming from all sources at all times in massive quantities and being shared with zero friction.
Well, I love the idea that I love hearkening back to the 90s and this idea that color was manipulative. It's objectively true, right, that images have a sort of a stronger biological pull for us than words. That in fact it's much easier to fall subject to whatever they have to tell us than words. Am I right in thinking that that's true?
I think so. I mean, I suddenly remembered the huge charged debate about colorizing old black and white movies, right? And how purists were just up in arms about that, which I understand. Also,
I have to say I don't remember that debate.
Well,
Sadly, I do.
Yeah. It had to do with, do I want to say, Turner Classic Movies, right? And anyway, they colorized some old films for broadcast. And, some people were not having it, and some people were like, oh, now I can see it and understand it because it's in color, right? I mean, that's just, yeah.
Go ahead.
Just 'cause I think, there are probably actual neurologists in the room, and I'm certainly not one, but I think the way that our brains process visual information versus linguistic information are fundamentally different and bypass, the interpretive parts of that process are completely unconscious, whereas they're far more conscious when processing linguistic information.
So anyone who's a subscriber of the New York Times today knows that you guys have embraced color, and in addition to that, you've embraced video, digital,
We changed our tune.
pictures, VR, AR. If you can do it, if you can make it, the New York Times is going to try it. And so one thing that I'm just very curious about is to who falls the responsibility of helping readers understand how to read images newly?
I mean, I think we would conceptually view that as part of what we are trying to do. Like, we create images very, very consciously. And particularly when we're talking about sort of visual stories and advanced visualization techniques, like data viz and the sort of reconstructions that we create, we're very mindful of how we create them. They're intended to be didactic and intended to lead someone down an interpretive path, not to overwhelm or manipulate. That's our intention anyway. So we do view that as part of our responsibility. I think you're pointing at something a little bit further down, which is like explicitly, like, might we or someone explicitly sort of teach people, how to think about an image when they're confronted with one in the context of, current technology. And that's something I don't think that we've contemplated just yet.
That makes sense.
Here, I fear that we're, the tsunami of images and visual information that we get have not helped in the sense that we're not visually sophisticated in a certain way. In one way, we are, because we see more and more incredible imagery all the time. But on the other hand, we don't know. Like, I always read the credits of what's been a photo illustration, for example. But I don't think many people do, and the people understand what has been manipulated for some reason and why. I don't think we're like collectively educated enough.
I would even go further and say it's important for us, particularly us in this business, to remember that 99.9% of the time, people are consuming images without interpretation even being part of their context at all. They're like, they're zooming through social media, they're seeing something, they're reacting. They might not even pause to think, is this real or not? They might be thinking just, is this funny or not? Right. Or, does this make me angry or not? They're reacting emotionally and then acting and sharing. They're not even in an interpretive mindset.
That's a really good point, and it presents this sort of existential challenge for a democracy, ultimately, which is, okay, then, well, how do we tell accurate stories, and to what degree can we hope and expect that people will learn to read accurate stories from images? One of the ways that I think about this is I think back to the beginning of the emergence of the written language and the printing press. And if you read the early work of people who were coming into the world just after the printing press, they complained of this thing, which sounds a lot like what I feel today, which is just this overabundance of information. Everybody can create it now, don't know how to process it. Mm-hmm. And I sometimes wonder if there's anything we can learn from that period that might apply to this period. Have you guys out in the world seen any interesting media literacy projects or any efforts to help people better decode this?
Well, some, and I would say here a plug, perhaps. I'm on the board of an organization called the News Literacy Project, which is geared primarily to middle and high school students learning an unenviable amount about how to interpret news and apply critical thinking to more sources than we ever imagined. I don't think there's enough of that, of media literacy and news literacy in general, and certainly not just for kids. I think it should start much younger than middle school, probably. But also, obviously, there's a need for adults. And some of it it goes back to the early days of the web, what Howard Rheingold has called crap detection 101. Which you can find online, by the way. He has a syllabus for crap detection. And it is really, look at the source of the URL. In those days, it was about what was crap on the web. But now we must go beyond that to dig into sources and to recognize reputable sources. That's not something in the stream people are going to necessarily do, but it's a good practice to get into when you see something questionable.
Yeah, I think educating the the public is an important thing to try to do. I also think it's sort of futile, or at least it's a very long-term effort. I mean, in the case of the printing press, we did at least have hundreds of years to work through that process, and now we have 5 minutes. So I think it'll never keep up with the pace of technological change. It's still important to do, but I think we still have to consider that we're operating in a world where where people are not prepared for what is coming at them, and they're just going to react in the moment. And what can we do? I actually tend to think of, not of the printing press, but of food. And
food?
What do we do? You put a bowl of chips in front of someone and they just want to eat it, right? So
it's true, Doritos are the worst.
So how do you start to tell people maybe you should think about that, and here's what's in that stuff, and it gets you down, thinking along the lines of can we just throw a little metadata on the images at the point of consumption to be kind of this might be bad for you, think about
a nutritional label,
kind of the nutritional label
Which
approach.
Shouldn't a brand be that? I mean, shouldn't the New York Times be that, so that I know that when I'm within the realm of the New York Times, I can mostly trust what's there?
Yeah, we are definitely kale, so that's part of what we're all about.
So if you're kale, what's NPR?
I don't know. Something delicious, I'm sure. But the problem is that our news is also being served out of context, right? So everything's happening. That's not where this needs to happen. It needs to happen on the platforms.
Right.
So they have this. They're the ones who have the opportunity to make a difference.
Which is a natural segue to talk for a second about the platforms, because of course they're in the spotlight right now. Mark Zuckerberg testified before the European Parliament earlier this week, if you could call that circus a testimony. And there's a great debate over whether and how we should regulate these platforms. And much of that debate boils down to the existential fear people have about the false information that is proliferating on them. And so I'm curious from both of you, your perspective on whether and how we should regulate these platforms, and if that could help this problem or maybe make it worse.
If by regulate you mean government bodies,
yes,
overseeing and determining, I'm not too excited about that prospect. Partly because, from what I've seen over the years, they're typically some of the last people to understand the underlying technologies, and that can lead to a lot of crazy and just wrong-headed assumptions about how to do things. And I have worked in tech for a long time, so of course I think tech can mostly figure this out. I think this has been this last period has been kind of a more serious wake-up call than most for them to get their acts together. But I will say it is an arms race. Whatever kind of bad actors are, using and manipulating the platforms, it's like the spam wars, right? There's constant sophistication on the bad side, and constantly new uses and new tools and new techniques that the platforms have to continuously monitor and keep up with. That is their job for sure. But it's not a one and done kind of situation by any means.
I think the arms race thought, puts me again in mind of the copyright battles in the music world. And I think one of the lessons we learned there is that, sometimes arms races can be productively fought. And, what we saw, like a similar situation, whatever digital rights management we put in place, pirates would be able to eventually get around it. There's a million ways. There was always the pure analog signal path, so it was kind of pointless. But it actually made a difference. The combination of fighting against piracy, through technological and legal tactics, plus creating better options, did ultimately yield a good result. And now the music industry is growing again.
Nick, I just want to stop you there and point out that what you described was not a magic bullet. It wasn't a one and done fix. That it was a lot of smart minds working really hard on incremental changes over time.
Yeah. Yes, and the real arms race, it will be, is fought against the very sophisticated participants like state actors, but it's still valuable to stop the kid in the basement who's just going to upload a video to a site and hack it together, and that's fairly easily detected. So I think I think it is an arms race, and that can seem daunting. But limiting the range of content, it is valuable. You don't have to win every fight.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I would say one thing the tech companies don't especially like to do, but they could do more of, is collaborate among themselves, right? And share a little more information than they like to, so that this does happen with security matters. So the tech companies do talk to each other. The security teams do talk to each other. What are you seeing? And here's what we're doing about it, that kind of thing. They could extend that sort of ongoing conversation and collaboration to some of these other, we're seeing signals of, bots from Macedonia that are suddenly overnight 1,000 new accounts. What are you seeing? That kind of thing, a lot more than they do.
I think security is a great analogy, and kind of in the vein of what I was saying. Like, it's hard to stop China if they want to penetrate your network, but it's easy and necessary to stop all the tens of thousands of kids who are running scripts against your infrastructure. So it's worth it. And I think the other thing that platforms could do is share a lot more, not just with each other, but with entities like the New York Times, like with journalists and investigators who are trying to do forensic work. One of our problems is it's they're actually stopping a lot of content at the source already today, but sometimes that's useful content for investigation. For example, like content that they're taking down because there's terrorist elements to it. That's actually really useful in an investigative context. If they could make some of that available, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I agree.
So, Karen, to go back to what you said about regulation, what I heard you say is essentially, tech companies, they think that they can fix this themselves, and you have faith that they might be better at fixing this themselves than the government would be at regulating them. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah.
So,
in a nutshell.
So it does though take it at its base that these platforms do need to be fixed. So what's the recipe for fixing them? We only have 10 minutes left.
We don't have enough time.
Can we run out of time just the moment we're gonna
Sorry, guys.
Well, it'll take a bunch of things, right? It's not just one. So one part is more inter-company collaboration and sharing of information that they might not want to.
I love that you said that. How do we incentivize it?
You'd think there'd be enough incentive with the threat of politicians saying we're going to regulate that they would bring themselves together. I don't know, honestly, how that goes. You'd think the smart people will say we need to collaborate more and also understand there are differences, obviously, between a Twitter and a Facebook and an Instagram, but there are some commonalities that may be uncovered by sharing some data. So I don't know how we make them do that, but I would like to think the smart people within those companies are understanding they need to do that more without having to argue for a long time about it and wasting time. In addition, there are a lot of more, I think, under the hood anticipatory things, signals, like I say, of, suddenly on Twitter, like, oh, where'd all these new accounts signups come from, with weird names or a lot of profiles here suddenly with no photos or, whatever signals that say something is funny here to look into, right?
Sure.
And every platform can pay a lot more attention to what's coming in and what's starting and what's, a new blip. For years, Google's had Google Trends. And the interesting thing about Google Trends is not how many billion people are looking up weather, because that's a constant, but the things that are the unusual spikes that aren't normal, right? And that's the sort of kind of mindset that I'm sure they do have internally, but they need to, put more people on as a matter of course, as an ongoing thing.
I think it's really interesting because these platforms have, very powerful, very intelligent founders, most of whom are motivated by some desire to do good in the world. And yet they are utterly blind to this particular situation. And I find it difficult to understand how Facebook, why they would not be concerned on their own account as like human beings that, the speed with which information propagates on their platform leads to people dying. We ran a story recently about an incident in Sri Lanka where a routine traffic accident that led to a fight became interpreted as sectarian violence and led to riots and a bunch more people being killed. That was all spread on Facebook. So I think they ought to be concerned about that as humans who theoretically care about the world. So regulation may be the stick that's required or the threat of regulation, but I would hope not. I would hope that at some point they would actually care. Just like if I were a car manufacturer, you could say, sure, drive your car into a wall. I don't care what you do with it, but that's not.
Really. You bring up such an interesting idea. I don't know that we know whether they care or they don't care as people. They certainly say that they care a lot, but I've reported on them for 15 years and know many of them personally. I think they do care a lot.
I think they do too.
But what do you do when your business model, the way that your company makes money, would need to essentially collapse and be re-envisioned to fix that problem from its core overnight?
I'm not sure that that's true.
Yeah.
I think there's a great deal that could be done that doesn't solve the problem, but makes it a bit better. And I think we're starting to see some of that activity. I think that's probably the way that things would go. But I think I would just encourage them to do more.
Yeah. As would we all.
It is definitely incremental, and there's a bunch of things to do. And I don't think maybe some of them think it's a dire, kind of do or die situation. But we know it's not. It's not. There are so many, toggles to switch, to adjust and control, which we see from the algorithms that you can make the same adjustments in the ads platform or in the, in the feeds and what people see and so on. It's a matter, it's even more constant testing, review, analysis, iteration.
Right. And I think that one thing that's remarkable with these platforms is that we, the world, have become one sort of ever-moving beta test for everything we're using all the time, when the smallest little whisper of a change can unleash a butterfly effect that we're not expecting, that happens in real time, that we need to account for. And that's a kind of responsibility that I suspect didn't exist before the 21st century among business leaders.
Permanent employment for data scientists.
Also that. Let's get a couple questions in. Anybody want to jump in with a question? Okay, right over here in the pink dress. We'll start with you. And if you could just give your name and affiliation before you ask the question.
Okay, hi. My name is DC Livers. I'm losing my voice. I apologize. I work with Black Press Radio, and I started when I was about 16 working for Scripps Howard. So I think it's interesting today that 15 years ago this month, they had Jason Blair and what we're calling the invention of fake news. So today you're talking about fake news again. But then as a reporter, I would always see when a white person committed a crime, the picture wasn't usually put up. But as soon as a black person could put it up, committed the crime, the picture was immediate. So do you think that we've been doing fake news by, kind of having prejudice in reporting?
That's a great question. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, the issue of bias in reporting is real, and it's real for everyone. It's real for the New York Times. It's real for everybody else. So, I mean, that's a very legitimate point. I think it's important not to throw the fake news label at every possible, at the whole range of, there's still a difference between, bad reporting, biased reporting in an institution that at least has some attempt to have safeguards against that versus purely malicious, manipulative, deliberate action from say the foreign government. So I think we need to look at the nuances, but you're absolutely right. That's just as fundamental a problem.
What's interesting now in the realm of traditionally authentic news organizations, let's say, is now that we're used to everyone being a real-time armchair critic, it is great to see people calling out hey, this photo versus that photo for this story, this treatment, this description of a person versus that description in the other story, people seem to me spot that sort of thing right away and call it out publicly, usually on Twitter, because it's so news heavy. And I find that fantastic because it raises awareness and calls the news organization to account immediately. And I would imagine people inside are sensitive and respond within legitimate news organizations.
Let's jump right way back there.
Hey, Trace Cohen. I do venture capital, but I'm sure everyone's seen Elon Musk tweeting last 24 hours. So I was just curious your thoughts on, he basically wants to create like a clout or Yelp for the media industry. Do you think that should exist? And how would you rate a journalist based on their work?
I like people who write good things about me. I would definitely give them a thumbs up on Yelp. How you guys?
Sure, why not? Like, if we're going to scrutinize people, we should be ready to be scrutinized. So bring it on.
That may be fine, but I'd say Mr. Musk has mighty thin skin.
Okay.
And flamethrowers.
Jump down here to Rick. We're bringing you a mic.
Rick brought Karen and I together.
Yeah, it's my fault. So one of the things that I never hear people really talking about is that the most profitable news organization out there, Fox News, to me was the originator of fake news. For 15 years, they've been spewing completely fabricated stories, very politically motivated. So we're all talking about fake stories on Facebook and all these sort of online entities. But what do you do when there's a behemoth out there that's making tremendous amounts of money? It's having a huge impact on our culture, on the world. And they are, some people would say, well, they're a legitimate news organization. How do you deal with that? I mean, to me, that's a bigger problem even than just what's happening on Facebook and Twitter.
Rick, in some ways, your question speaks to our first question, which is what do you do about legitimate news organizations that are simply not delivering real news?
Exactly, right.
Or all the news. Yeah. So you guys have the answers, so
I know the New York Times is not supposed to necessarily criticize other news entities. It seems like people are very skittish about criticizing their competitors, but I don't regard Fox News as a news organization. It's a propaganda machine.
So, I mean, personally, I find Fox News maddening and nauseating. But objectively, they have a reason and a right to exist. I think it is naive to say that we all exist on some continuum, pure objectivity. Some of us try harder, some of us don't try at all, but it's, none of us are going to achieve it completely. And there's too many ways to play the game that, there's a continuum between news and opinion or satire and all of these ways that the lines get blurred. And I think it's just a feature of reality. So we can be outraged about it, but there will always be a Fox News. There always has been a Fox News. So, I think the best we can do is try to invite scrutiny on the media industry, educate people to make up their minds in intelligent ways, and hope for the best.
I have one more question I want to get to, and do you want to add it to anything? Okay. Over here.
Paul Melcher from Capture. Everyone here in the room knows pretty much that images can be fabricated and very good quality by computers. So I'm just curious, especially in the New York Times, do you have safeguards against or trying to detect any fake images or fake videos? We've seen a lot with deep fake, for example, coming up. And what are your safeguards?
So we carefully work to validate any imagery that we're going to use, right? It's not our job to go out and scrutinize every image on the internet or something like that, but anything that we're going to run, we do. And the most powerful tools that we have to validate things are actually comparison with other sources. So if that's why there's great resources at our disposal now to get comparable imagery of the same place, the same people, the same incident, to try to build evidence around a particular image or piece of video. So we work very hard at it, and there actually there was a we did an incredible investigation in Pakistan, I think it was a year and a half ago or so, where there was a piece of video of a drone attack, and we had to find out if it was real. So we sent people to Pakistan to try to find the person who had the phone that took that video, and it was this epic struggle. But it was that's the kind of lengths that we will go to. Plus, we do also do forensic work. We'll look at the metadata. We'll be able to use that to also help validate. We'll do detailed analysis of time of day and geometry and physics to try to get any evidence. So it's a manual process and an art for the most part, but we take it very seriously.
We have one more question. Make it super quick if that's okay.
Hi, I'm Myron Casaraba with MJK Partners. I guess to follow on this, you're saying that everybody's got a lot of data, but the reality is that Facebook and Twitter basically strip most of the metadata as soon as you upload a picture, so it becomes a new picture rather than something going back to the source. So should we be putting pressure on Facebook and Twitter and others to actually preserve source metadata, so then you don't have to do such forensics of trying to compare pictures, but you actually have some validity of the source?
That seems like a good idea to me. I don't know the under the hood stuff enough, but as a concept, I think that's a really good idea.
Metadata, this is not really totally germane question, but metadata can be faked too. So, I think it's valuable. We would like access to the metadata for assets on social media. They also have to consider privacy, so it's somewhat complex, but I think absolutely, we would be thrilled if that metadata were available in some form.
And so ultimately, it's a wonderful place to tie this conversation together. We've heard a lot about the opportunity and the possibility that visual data unlocks for us in storytelling, but also the skepticism that it's on all of us to engender in the people who absorb it. Thanks a lot for this conversation. Back to Evan.
Thank you.